Earth was nothing more than a blue speck in the vast galaxy, and to the extraterrestrial warlords, it was another world to conquer. Their ships hovered over the planet like silent predators, watching with cold, calculating precision. For eons they had dominated the stars, their empire spanning countless worlds. Earth was just another target, an insignificant planet with primitive defenses, a laughable species, and the quaint myths of old civilizations. The warlords saw no challenge here, no threat. Earth's military, though advanced by human standards, was a trivial obstacle. The warlords deployed their advanced drones and soldiers with ease, quickly dismantling the planet's defenses. Skyscrapers crumbled, entire cities were razed in mere hours, and the once defiant human forces fell to their knees, overwhelmed by technology they could barely comprehend. The warlords strode through the chaos, observing the wreckage with the same indifference they had shown to every other planet they had conquered. Amidst the smoldering ruins, humans clung to their old ways. Their ancient temples, crumbling churches, and monuments stood as relics of a bygone era. The warlords, curious yet dismissive, took special interest in these sights. They scoffed at the priests who whispered tales of gods and warriors, warning of powers that would rise in Earth's darkest hour. One warlord, towering and cloaked in an impenetrable exosuit, sneered at the old man who claimed that the gods would never allow Earth to fall to such invaders. "Your gods are nothing but stories," the warlord spat, his voice thick with condescension. "Myths created by weak minds to comfort you. You cling to the past because you have no future." The old man, with trembling hands, clutched his talisman and whispered a prayer under his breath. The warlord laughed, smashing the relic to the ground with a swift kick, the symbol cracking beneath his boot. To the warlords, there was no greater absurdity than humanity's belief in gods that never showed up, warriors who never arrived to defend them. They had heard similar stories on countless planets, myths created by inferior races to explain their suffering. But nothing had ever saved them. And Earth, they believed, would be no different. As the occupation dragged on, the warlords established their strongholds across the globe. The human resistance, scattered and leaderless, fought back in desperation. Guerrilla tactics and sabotage were their only options, but even those efforts were often crushed. The warlords, ever confident, made sport of hunting down the remnants of humanity's fighters, broadcasting their victories across the stars as proof of their superiority. They used Earth as a symbol, a warning to any planet that dared oppose them. But something lingered beneath the surface, something the warlords had not anticipated. As they expanded their reach, they began to explore Earth's ancient ruins, its forgotten temples. They saw these places as nothing more than remnants of a primitive past, treasures to be looted or destroyed. Yet, as they desecrated one temple after another, strange phenomena began to stir. Shadows grew longer, the air became heavier, and an unsettling energy pulsed beneath their feet. Still, they dismissed it all. Earth was a conquered world, and its myths were just stories told by a defeated people. The warlords moved freely, stripping the planet of its resources, taking what they wanted without fear of reprisal. In one of the most ancient temples, nestled in the mountains, a group of warlords found an old statue, a warrior, holding a spear, eyes cast down as if waiting for something. "Look at this," one of the warlords said, brushing away the dust. "More nonsense. Another god of theirs?" His companion chuckled. "Another worthless relic from a dead race." They shattered the base of the statue and removed the gemstones embedded in its eyes, tossing them into their bags as loot. The statue cracked, a low rumble echoing through the temple. The warlords paused, glancing around but seeing nothing to fear. The ground beneath them quivered, but they ignored it, laughing once more at the foolishness of the humans who had worshipped such stone idols. But as they left the temple, the earth itself seemed to breathe. Something ancient stirred beneath the surface. The myths they had mocked were beginning to awaken, and the warlords, so confident in their superiority, remained blissfully unaware of the doom they had set in motion. They continued their occupation, oblivious to the gathering storm. For now, their conquest was complete. Earth was subdued, its people broken, and its gods nowhere to be seen. But that was about to change. The temple had been ransacked, its ancient walls stripped of anything valuable, and the warlords moved on, leaving behind what they thought was a hollow monument to long-forgotten gods. The ground where they had shattered the statue still trembled slightly, a pulse rippling through the soil, unnoticed by the invaders. It was as if the very land itself was waking from a deep, restless sleep. As the warlords continued to spread across the planet, searching for new resources, another team stumbled upon an even more obscure ruin, buried beneath centuries of earth and vegetation. This one was different, older, more remote. Its walls were carved with symbols that even Earth's own archaeologists had never fully deciphered. The structure seemed out of place, almost too pristine despite its age. A heavy, oppressive silence hung over the site as if time itself had chosen to avoid this place. The lead warlord, unimpressed by the site's eerie aura, led his team inside. Their lights flickered as they entered, the walls closing in around them like a forgotten tomb. More symbols covered the walls, but these depicted something more violent, scenes of war, of gods locked in battle, their faces twisted in fury. The deeper they went, the darker the carvings became, showing not just war, but devastation on a cosmic scale. Still, the warlords saw only superstition, ancient human fear etched into stone. At the far end of the temple, they found a sealed chamber. Its door was massive, adorned with runes that glowed faintly under their lights. The warlords, still convinced that this was just another cache of worthless relics, set to work forcing the door open. As they pried it apart, the air around them grew colder, thick with a presence they couldn't quite explain. With a final shove, the doors groaned open, revealing a chamber untouched for millennia. In the center stood a towering figure, a statue like none they had seen before. Unlike the stone idols they had desecrated earlier, this one was different. The warlord leading the team stared up at it, sensing something in the air. The statue, more lifelike than any they had encountered, depicted a warrior clad in ancient armor, holding a spear that seemed to hum with an energy of its own. Its face was obscured by a helmet, but beneath it, the faintest trace of eyes seemed to follow them. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the warlords' minds. But it was too late to turn back now. The leader of the team approached the statue, reaching out to touch the base where the runes glowed faintly. As his hand made contact, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. The walls groaned, and dust began to fall from the ceiling. The warlord stepped back, suddenly unsure, but the others laughed nervously, attributing the tremors to the old structure settling under their weight. Then the runes burst into light, blinding and violent, sending shockwaves through the air. The warlord recoiled, shielding his eyes, but the damage had already been done. The earth beneath the temple began to quake in earnest, cracks forming in the stone floor. Something deep within the planet was stirring, an ancient force long forgotten by humans, but never truly gone. Outside, the sky darkened. Storm clouds gathered unnaturally fast, swirling above the temple as if drawn to it. The winds howled, trees bent and snapped, and animals fled in terror. In the distance, across the globe, people looked up, confused by the sudden change in weather. But it wasn't just a storm. The earth itself was responding, groaning and rumbling as if trying to break free of something. Back inside the temple, the warlords struggled to regain control of the situation. The statue, no longer just a statue, began to move. Slowly, deliberately, the stone cracked, revealing glowing veins of molten energy running through the warrior's form. The warlords, who had been so confident in their technological prowess, stared in horror as the ancient being came to life before their eyes. The myths they had mocked, the gods they had ridiculed, were no longer just stories. The war god's eyes, now fully opened, blazed with a power not of this world. Its form, once confined to stone, grew with each passing second, drawing energy from the very earth beneath it. The air around the warlords thickened, becoming hard to breathe as the pressure built. One of them shouted a command, but it was lost in the chaos. The war god raised its spear, the tip glowing with the intensity of a sun, and the chamber exploded in a flash of light. The warlords, once mighty and feared across the galaxy, were thrown back, their armor cracking, their weapons useless. The lead warlord, stunned and bleeding, scrambled to his feet, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no time. The war god stepped forward, its heavy footfalls shaking the temple to its foundation. The warlords, who had never known fear, felt it for the first time. They fled. The mighty warlords who had subjugated entire planets, who had crushed civilizations beneath their boots, ran in terror from an ancient force they had foolishly awoken. As they stumbled out of the temple and into the storm, they realized too late the truth of the myths they had dismissed. Earth was not just another planet, and its gods were not just legends. The war god, now fully awake, stepped out into the world it had once protected, and the ground trembled beneath its feet. It was not just a being of stone and energy, but a force of nature, tied to the very soul of the planet. The storm above intensified, lightning crackling across the sky, and the war god turned its gaze to the horizon, where the warlords' ships hovered like black clouds. The warlords had made a fatal mistake, and now they would face the consequences. The storm raged across the sky, swirling with an intensity that made even the warlords pause in their retreat. Thunder cracked in the heavens, and bolts of lightning seared the air as the war god strode out of the temple, its form towering above the ruins, molten veins pulsing with power. The air itself seemed to vibrate in its presence. The warlords, still reeling from the shock of what they had unleashed, scrambled to regroup, but the ground beneath their feet buckled and cracked as if the planet itself were rejecting them. In their panic, they attempted to deploy their technology, summoning drones and fighters to engage this new threat. From their hovering ships, they launched volleys of plasma and high-energy weaponry, confident that no organic or physical entity could withstand their firepower. But the war god did not falter. The bolts of energy struck its form and dissipated harmlessly, as if absorbed into its being. The war god raised its spear, and with a single, sweeping motion, the sky itself seemed to tear open. A deafening roar echoed across the landscape, and from the heavens, a wave of destruction surged downward. It was not a mere explosion of force. It was the unleashing of something far more ancient and primal. Lightning, fire, and earth combined into a storm of raw elemental fury, and as it hit the warlords' ships, they were torn apart as if they were made of paper. The once indomitable fleet was reduced to wreckage in seconds, the smoking remains plummeting to the ground in flames. On the ground, the surviving warlords stared in disbelief. Their entire armada, designed to conquer worlds, had been wiped out in a matter of moments. For the first time in their long reign of terror, they were powerless, facing something that defied all reason and logic. The war god, its glowing eyes locked on the invaders, advanced without hesitation. Each step shook the earth, and with every movement, the power it wielded became more apparent. It was a force beyond their comprehension, an embodiment of the very planet they had sought to conquer. Desperation set in. The warlords, who had never known defeat, now tasted fear. They ordered their remaining ground forces to engage, throwing every weapon and soldier they had left at the war god. Tanks, walkers, and advanced mech surged forward, unleashing a torrent of firepower. Yet nothing they threw at it made a difference. The war god's form shimmered as it absorbed the attacks, its presence growing even stronger. With a gesture, the war god summoned the elements to its aid. The ground beneath the advancing warlord forces erupted, jagged spikes of rock shooting upward, impaling machines and soldiers alike. Rivers of molten lava tore through their ranks, swallowing the invaders whole. From the storm clouds above, bolts of lightning struck with pinpoint precision, annihilating anything that dared move against it. The warlords' finest soldiers, trained across the galaxy, battle-hardened from countless campaigns, were reduced to ash in the face of this unstoppable force. Humanity, watching from the shadows, began to stir. The war god's arrival had sparked something deep within them, a defiant spark that refused to be extinguished. The remnants of human resistance, scattered and disorganized, started to rally. In small groups, they began to fight back, taking advantage of the chaos. Guerrilla fighters struck at the warlords' weakened positions, and as the war god continued to decimate their enemies, humanity's morale soared. They had been beaten down, but now they saw a chance to reclaim their world. The war god's relentless assault continued, and the warlords, now leaderless and broken, began to turn on each other. Some attempted to flee, their ships barely operational, but the storm above blocked their escape. Others, desperate and out of options, tried to communicate with the humans. They offered deals, promises of peace, anything to avoid their annihilation. But humanity had no interest in their terms. They had witnessed the true power of their planet's ancient protector, and they knew now that the invaders were not invincible. The war god, sensing the warlords' despair, showed no mercy. It moved through their ranks with the precision of a seasoned warrior, cutting down the remnants of their forces with ease. Its spear, glowing with celestial energy, cleaved through their strongest defenses as if they were nothing. Every swing, every strike, was a reminder of the myths the warlords had once mocked, a reminder that Earth's history was not just stories but a living force, tied to the very essence of the planet. As the battle raged on, the warlords' numbers dwindled. Their once mighty army was now a scattered, broken mess, their ships little more than smoldering ruins. The ground, soaked in the blood of invaders, shook one last time as the war god delivered the final blow. With a single, powerful strike, it plunged its spear into the earth, sending a shockwave that rippled across the battlefield. The warlords, those who still stood, were thrown back, their bodies shattered by the force. Silence fell. The storm above began to dissipate, the winds calming as the war god stood victorious. The warlords, once the terror of the galaxy, lay defeated, broken by a force they had never believed in. The battlefield was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the war god's final strike. The once imposing warlords were now nothing more than wreckage strewn across the landscape, their arrogance and advanced technology reduced to ruin. The ground where they had stood was scorched, and the air crackled with residual energy from the god's immense power. Earth had reclaimed itself, not through the efforts of human ingenuity, but through an ancient force that had lain dormant, waiting for its moment to awaken. The war god, now standing alone amidst the destruction, was still for a long time, as if surveying the wreckage, taking in the silence of a world it had once sworn to protect. Its form, still pulsing with molten energy, seemed to dim slightly, as if the battle had drained some of its essence. The spear it wielded was still embedded in the earth, a symbol of the planet's triumph over those who had sought to subjugate it. Slowly, deliberately, the war god pulled the weapon free, its eyes glowing faintly as it turned toward the horizon. Humanity, watching from the shadows, emerged cautiously. They had fought back in small ways, but they knew that this victory was not theirs alone. The war god had been the force that had saved them from certain destruction. In its presence, they felt something beyond mere awe. They felt the weight of their ancestors, the strength of the myths they had forgotten or dismissed as old stories. This ancient protector was not just a god of war. It was a living embodiment of their history, of everything that had been lost over the centuries. As the surviving humans gathered, they felt a newfound sense of unity. The warlords' invasion had torn them apart, but the war god's presence had brought them together. They realized now that their myths, the stories passed down through generations, were more than just fables. They were a connection to something far older and more powerful than they had ever understood. The war god's revival had reminded them of their roots, of the strength that had always been within them, waiting to be awakened. The war god, sensing the shift in the air, turned its gaze toward the humans. For a moment, there was an understanding between them. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. The god had not come to rule or control, it had come to protect, to ensure that Earth would remain free. But now that the battle was over, it was time for the war god to return to the place from which it had come. Its time in the physical world was limited, tied to the very myths and legends that had sustained it for so long. Slowly, the war god began to fade. Its form, once towering and solid, shimmered like the surface of a lake, rippling with energy as it began to dissolve back into the earth. The molten veins of power that had coursed through its body dimmed to a dull glow, and the spear it had wielded so fiercely was slowly absorbed back into the ground, returning to the planet it had defended. The sky, once filled with storms and fury, began to clear, and the air felt lighter, as if the planet itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The war god gave one final look to the humans before it disappeared completely. Its eyes, still glowing faintly, seemed to convey a message: this was not the end. Though the god had returned to its resting place, its spirit would always be a part of the earth, watching over those who walked its surface. The myths, now proven real, would remain, passed down once again as stories of strength and defiance, of gods and warriors who would rise when needed most. With the war god gone, humanity stood in the aftermath of both destruction and renewal. The warlords, who had once seemed invincible, had been vanquished. Their ships were nothing more than broken husks, their weapons scattered across the battlefield, useless in the face of the ancient power they had awakened. The world was scarred, but it was free. In the days that followed, humanity began to rebuild. The ruins of their cities were cleared, and the survivors worked together in ways they hadn't before. There was a renewed sense of purpose, a belief in their own resilience. They had faced the worst that the galaxy could throw at them and had survived, not just through technology or brute force, but through the spirit of something much deeper. The war god's brief appearance had ignited something within them, a reminder that they were part of a much larger story, one that stretched back millennia. As they rebuilt, the old myths and stories were no longer just bedtime tales. They were spoken of with reverence, as reminders of the war god who had once walked among them. Temples and monuments were restored, not to glorify the god, but to honor the connection between humanity and the planet they called home. The warlords' invasion had tested them, but in the end, it had strengthened their bond with the earth and with the legends that had shaped them. Even the scholars and scientists, who had once dismissed these myths as nothing more than folklore, now understood their importance. They began to study the ancient texts with new eyes, searching for the hidden truths buried within the stories of gods and warriors. What had once been viewed as mere superstition was now a source of fascination and respect. Humanity's past had proven to be far more powerful than anyone had imagined, and the future, though uncertain, seemed brighter because of it. And so, life continued. The world was forever changed, but it was not broken. The warlords, with all their technology and arrogance, had been defeated not by superior firepower, but by the very force they had mocked. The war god had shown them, and humanity, that there were powers in the universe that could not be measured by technology or weapons. Earth was more than just a planet, it was a living, breathing entity with a history and strength all its own. As the sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows over the rebuilt cities, the people of Earth looked to the future with a renewed sense of hope. They had been reminded of who they were, of the strength that lay within their stories and their past. And though the war god had returned to its slumber, they knew that it would always be there, watching over them, waiting for the time when it might be needed again.